Mirrors by Greensearcher. Chapter 24, Part 2. "Oh, Belle, he's 10 times as handsome as Gaston," Laurette whispered excitedly. Belle flushed. "That's not why I... And tall," Paulette sighed, eyes distant and dreamy. "And so strong." "Well, I suppose you were holding out on us," Laurette added, grabbing her arm and peeking around her shoulder for a better look. Belle opened her mouth to explain before realizing that was entirely impossible. Instead, she just sighed, turning back to watch the match before them. After 2 more weeks of recruiting across the countryside, they reached Molyneux once again. Adam had overcome much of his social anxiety already, and now had a few reservations when it came to mingling with anyone and everyone he met. As such, he presently found himself in a friendly tournament with several other of the younger men from the town, and a large crowd had gathered to watch. What a peculiar prince, Belle thought with warmth, remembering the first time she had thought so all those months ago. It was strange to be in her hometown once again, to see the people who had once scorned or at best ignored her, to suddenly be treated like she was a royal simply because she was courting one. No doubt that explained Laurette and Paulette's sudden familiarity with her. Their new friendliness wasn't the only thing that was strange. By now, of course, Gaston's disappearance had long since been accepted by the villagers. Yet, from what the old bookseller told Belle, few tears had been shed at his loss. And it was then she realized what she perceived as respect for him had likely been nothing other than fear. Even the triplets seemed no worse for wear at his absence, though Belle didn't know yet why. Only that Claudette had gone to live with some distant relatives for a time. The shouts in the square grew, and Belle watched as the man Adam had been matched with was disarmed. Adam quickly pulled back, tucking his own weapon into his belt and helping the man back to his feet. He said something she couldn't hear, but whatever it was made his opponent smile wide and laughed. "Did you really find him, Belle?" Laurette asked, eager. "Save him from the palace where Victor had imprisoned him?" That was an exaggerated story of what Adam and his father had conveyed to the people to explain Belle's involvement, though in a way it quite underestimated the truth. "I mean, I suppose," Belle shrugged. "To think someone so gorgeous was locked away all this time," Paulette called then, a hand over her chest. "How heartbreaking." "Look," Laurette said quickly. "Here he comes." Belle raised a brow. Adam's good looks were no secret, of course, but she hoped the girls would at least tone it down, considering he was her beau. At that thought, Belle stopped. It was a new kind of irritation she had never felt before. "Huh," she wondered, frowning. Adam hurried towards Belle then, looking as though he meant to ask her something. However, upon noticing their company, he stopped. "Oh, bonjour. I'm Adam," he said politely, then cleared his throat. "Prince Adam, I guess. And you?" Laurette, all things considered, was actually a bit more sensible than her sisters. Yet to be in the presence of such a rarely bestowed masculine beauty was far too much even for her, and in response she simply gaped at him. Beside her, Paulette dissolved into nervous giggles. "Paulette, your highness," she managed after a moment, batting her eyes and lifting one hand, with a clear wish for her prince to bestow a kiss on its surface. Belle pouted at that, feeling that twinge of annoyance grow tenfold. "Really, Paulette?" Meanwhile, Adam stared at the offered hand, a dozen silent cogs whirling in his mind as he tried to recall the proper thing to do. Suddenly he brightened and reached for Paulette's hand and gave it a firm shake. "A pleasure to make your acquaintance," he said in earnest. It's so good to meet Belle's friends." He smiled warmly then and glanced back at Belle. "Did I do okay?" His look seemed to ask. Oh goodness, he was so oblivious to what Paulette had really wanted, and so utterly without guile that, in Belle's annoyance, quickly vanished in an instant. In fact, it was all she could do not to laugh on the spot. Her grin seemed to placate him, and Adam's shoulders relaxed. "Prince Adam!" Looking towards the sound of the voice, Adam gave a quick nod in its direction before turning back to them. He bowed to Paulette and her sister, then reached up for Belle's hand. "Love you," he said happily, kissing her on the flat of the mouth before jogging off to where Cogsworth was waiting for him. Meanwhile, the girls nearly fainted. "He's so bold!" Laurette cried. Belle bit her lip, trying to hide her smile. In truth, Adam just hadn't a clue couples usually didn't show affection in the middle of the street. Of course, how would he? And, well, Belle wasn't about to tell him. He was so open with his joy and love right now, and she'd hate to spoil that. "He is a little funny, though, isn't he?" Paulette observed then. Laurette elbowed her on the side. "I mean in a good way," she backtracked quickly. "Like you, Belle." Laurette shot her sister a look, clearly indicating that wasn't any better. Then she looked back at Belle and grimaced. "Belle, we're sorry. We should have been nicer to you all those years." Belle paled in embarrassment. "Oh, it's all right," she said awkwardly, looking away. "I wasn't very sociable and—" "No," Laurette insisted, shaking her head. "It wasn't right. Especially—" She paused, sucking in a shaky breath. Especially after what your mother did for us." Belle blinked in surprise, looking back. "What do you mean?" I think that's why she got sick," Laurette admitted, voice growing thick. "Maman had it too. The coughing. But after your mother cared for her all those weeks, she started to get better again." She was crying now, rubbing her eyes furiously against her sleeve. But I think that's why your mother—" Paulette, now herself, looked devastated, clearly not having put this together until now. It must have been the first time Laurette expressed it aloud. Belle was quiet, heart thundering in her chest. She forced it to quiet, forced her throat to clear before she spoke. "We don't know that for certain," she said quietly, rationally. And suddenly the aching in her heart dissolved into a strange kind of understanding. She looked up at the girls before her. "And even if that's why, I think Maman would have done it again." Laurette looked up then, eyes wet and wide with awe. "You're really nice, Belle," she said, sniffling. "I think we could have been good friends, actually." Paulette nodded slowly in agreement, biting her own lip and looking at her feet. Belle's mouth fell open in surprise. Of all the strange things that had happened in the past year, this was one thing she never would have seen coming. Slowly, she smiled. "We are good friends," she decided. Laurette blinked, and the two sisters brightened at once, and before Belle could say anything more, they had wrapped her up in a tight hug. When they pulled back, a little girl was at their side. Her light brown hair fell in big brown ringlets, pulled away from her face with a small white bonnet. She had the same distinct button nose like the triplets. Their youngest sister was now tugging on their skirts. "Who's he?" she asked eagerly, pointing towards the closest bench. Chip sat there, munching on a bowl of stew and watching the surrounding people with interest. "He is with the king's party," Laurette explained. "Why don't you go say hello?" Their sister nodded quickly, running off in Chip's direction. She paused at his side, placing her hands behind her back and leaning towards him. "Bonjour!" Chip started, turning quickly to see who had surprised him. She smiled. "I'm going to play with my friends. Want to come?" Chip only stared at her. The tips of his ears were starting to go scarlet. "Can't you talk?" she asked, frowning. "Oh, yeah, I can. He fumbled. He put his bowl down and stared at his feet. I can't run, though." "Why not?" He nodded towards his crutches, leaning against the bench beside him. "My legs don't work well. I mean, not yet," he added quickly. "They will later. I just have to practice more." "Oh, well, that's okay," she said, taking the seat beside him. Chip flushed further as she did. "We can play a sitting game. It's called Murder," she went on, leaning close. "You all sit in a circle and pass out cards, and someone is the murderer. But you don't know and have to guess." "The murderer?" Chip asked nervously. "Not really. It's just pretend," she giggled. Then, with a coy turn of her head, very much resembling that of her three older sisters, she went on, "And we have to hold hands." You do?" Chip asked, eyes growing wide. "Uh-huh. That's how you share a clue." she went on matter-of-factly, standing again. Want to play? Chip nodded earnestly, an excited smile now stretching over his face. He reached for his crutches and stood, following her across the road. Do you need help? She asked. Nah, I got it, Chip said with confidence, moving into the street with more gusto than he had ever moved before. I'm Nicolette, she said then, prancing happily beside him. What's your name? Chip. He started, then stopped. I mean, Jack. My name's Jack.
Turning our people against Victor has been far easier than I thought, Alexander observed with no small amusement. They're dying to get their hands on him.
Adam grinned. While their travels across the countryside had revealed more poverty, like in Bruceville, the other towns had escaped the worst of Victor's abuse and offered vast numbers of volunteers for the cause. And even the most desolate of villages seemed rejuvenated at the prospect of dethroning the king that had ruined them. And now they were here in Molyneux, not an hour's hard ride from the palace. The palace, where his uncle was no doubtedly blindly indulging himself on the castle's comforts, and the enchantress weakening his army without any idea how close she was to defeat. Adam reached unconsciously for the sword at his hip, gripping the handle and narrowing his eyes. He had become accustomed to it being there, knowing what he'd need to do, but the weapon still felt heavy at his side. Someone touched his arm, and he looked over. Belle stood there, the sight of her lifting the heaviness away. He let go of the hilt and wrapped an arm around her. But before he could say anything, someone else approached. Your Majesty, Your Highness, Cogsworth said to him and his father, bowing stiffly before pulling a sheet from his belt. I've arranged a final meeting with the village officials, and after a final address before... Adam tuned him out, biting back a groan. While he had actually quite enjoyed all the new interactions, and the chance to finally do something this past fortnight, it had come at the sacrifice of spending time with Belle. Did Cogsworth really have to claim every hour of his day?
We'll be there in a minute,
Adam fibbed, reaching for Belle's hand and starting to inch away.
Belle's just going to,
He thought quickly and raised a finger.
She's going to show me her old school.
Belle raised a brow at him as they scurried off, but didn't mention it until they were out of earshot. Adam, she said then, you know I didn't go to school.
I do, he agreed, but Cogsworth doesn't.
Belle blinked twice, and then grinned. Well then, where are we going? He squeezed her hand.
Your house?
He asked hopefully. It was technically her old school, after all, so he hadn't lied to Cogsworth exactly. Belle, however, just paused in her tracks. But you've already seen it, she said, biting her lip. In Agatha's mirror, remember?
Well, sure, but that doesn't count.
He pouted a little.
Please.
Belle took one look at him and sighed. All right, she smiled. Still, she seemed a bit uneasy, though Adam couldn't imagine why. They walked hand in hand towards the edge of town, a few villagers heading in the opposite direction, holding lanterns against the growing shadows. Many who caught sight of Adam bowed, though their children simply waved at them happily. Hi, Belle, a little girl cried. Beside her, her parents smiled. Belle blinked in surprise, hesitated, and then waved back at them tentatively. It was her hometown, yet she seemed taken aback when greeted by her own neighbours. Nearing a steep hill at the edge of town, Belle stopped, looking behind her. They're only being nice to me because of you, she said under her breath. Adam frowned.
No, they're being nice because you're a hero,
he said adamantly.
And they realised how foolish they were not to see how great you were before.
Belle raised her brows at him, but her eyes seemed a little happier regardless. Soon she was leading him up old stone steps, sunk deep into the hillside, stopping before a small but sturdy house at the top. He had seen it so many times in the mirror that it felt strange to be looking at it with his own eyes. In person, he could see the full expanse of twilight-tinted sky behind the small house, the trees spotting the larger hills to the south. The air was still warm, crickets chirping somewhere nearby as night inched across the distant fields. It was a bucolic scene. the air filled with smells of summer that made Adam feel unusually calm. Adam took Belle's lantern for her as they approached the covered porch, pressing his free hand to one sturdy oak beam as he waited for her to pull a key from her pocket. He could feel patterns carved into the wood beneath his fingers, worn by time and weather. Beside him, Belle turned the lock and pushed open the door. Adam followed her inside, holding out the light and looking around the open space. Open and empty.
My wife, she's very ill. I've sold everything I can to afford her care.
Maurice's words echoed in his thoughts as Adam recalled that first, fated night he had found him trying to steal from the castle. He cast his eyes around the empty room, truly understanding how desperate the man had really been. It wasn't always so bare, Belle whispered beside him. Adam looked back down at her, suddenly understanding her embarrassment from before.
I know,
he said softly. He reached for her hand.
Tell me what used to be here.
So she did. A table and chairs in the kitchen, a large cabinet with her grandmother's old dishes, a rocking chair beside the hearth, a large blue sofa she'd often fallen asleep on with a book. Adam smiled at that last one.
Hey, what are these?
He asked, noticing several small shreds of parchment pinned along one wall of the narrow hallway they now walked through. Oh, Papa always refused to take them down, she explained. It's a little embarrassing, actually. I couldn't have been more than 4 when I made that one. Adam followed her gaze to a sketch of a very round, 5-legged creature. He ran his fingers along its edge, careful not to smudge the old charcoal.
Philippe,
he read along the bottom, chuckling. Belle grinned in amusement, her cheeks flushing in the dim light. Adam's gaze drifted across the wall, noticing several careful lines carved into its surface that climbed up one supporting beam. A date was noted carefully beside each one, marking a child's height.
Is that the summer you grew a lot?
He asked, pointing at the largest gap. Belle laughed quietly. Yes. He ran his fingers over the grooves, heart warming at the sight. He wasn't sure why, but seeing these remnants of Belle's childhood made him love her even more. Made him wish he could have known her then. Come, Belle whispered. For some reason both spoke quietly, here in this dark and empty home. I want to show you something. Taking the lantern back, Belle guided him around a corner to the base of a narrow ladder, tucked into the darkness. She climbed up quickly, turning and holding the light so he could follow. Not 2 steps up, the ladder creaked under his weight. He cursed, but Belle only smiled. Don't worry, she said from above. They've always done that, especially whenever Papa had to come up here. Nodding, he finished the short climb and found himself in an attic with a ceiling low enough that he had to duck. In fact, the walls and ceiling were one, meeting in the middle at the point. A single window sat in one slanted wall, staring out across the southern countryside, though it was almost completely covered in darkness now. Adam looked over the rest of the small space. A chest sat in one corner, a small pile of books at its side. Several bouquets of dried flowers hung from nails along the wall, the rest of the wooded surface covered with patterns of trees and landscapes drawn into the fading white chalk. Scuffs along the floor indicated a small bed frame was once here, but all that was left now was a bedroll tucked against the wall. Belle unfastened the latter. She spread the thick bedding across the floor and looked back at him. My room, she explained a bit shyly. It's not much, but it does have one thing the castle doesn't. She beckoned him over, and Adam scanned the space for any sign of what she meant as he moved to sit by her side on the thick quilt. Dimming the lantern, Belle laid on her back, pulling him down with her. Beau? He asked in confusion. Look, she said, pointing to the ceiling above. Adam followed her gaze, but saw nothing but the dark wooded beams above them. That is, until Belle reached and pulled on a cord hidden in the shadows. The sound of spinning hinges echoed in the small space, and suddenly a wide patch of the roof was opening above them. The sky was dark now, revealing the first signs of stars.
Whoa!
Adam breathed, smiling. She'd been right. Not even the palace had anything quite like this. Papa made it for me, Belle exclaimed. I think he was tired of finding me stargazing on the roof.
On the roof?
She grinned a bit, snuggling up closer to him and staring back at the nighttime sky. It's nothing close to the view from the peak, but it was always nice to fall asleep beneath the stars. His heart warmed again. He imagined a younger Belle, alone in this small attic space, wondering about the world above. He remembered himself, staring out of his balcony as a boy, and wondering the same. He was glad they could wander together now.
Speaking of wandering, your friends, are they twins? Adam asked suddenly, curious.
He'd never seen two people who looked so much alike before. But then he hadn't really seen that many people, period, in a long time.
I wasn't sure if it was rude to ask.
Belle chuckled. You could have asked. But actually, they're triplets. The third... She stopped, growing serious. This was told to me in confidence. Adam nodded. She's with child, Belle said quietly. She left to stay with a relative further south for her confinement.
But what about the father?
He abandoned her.
What? Adam asked in shock. How could he do that? Didn't he love her? Doesn't he want his child?
Belle's eyes seemed to soften at his words, and Adam realised his own ignorance even before she explained. A wife and child are expensive, she explained. Many men would rather escape the burden than taking responsibility for such a mistake.
But she still has to...
He trailed off, frowning deeply.
We should find him. Make him provide for her.
Adam, it's not that easy, Belle said calmly. She looked away. Besides, he's dead now.
How do you...
He stopped, noticing the dark look in Belle's eyes.
His own grew wide. Gaston, he realised awfully. Oh my God, that bastard!
He's gone. There's no reason to be angry anymore. Belle shrugged. Perhaps so, but Adam couldn't help but feel that old anger again anyway.
The kingdom should help care for people in that position, he decided. What is she supposed to do now? That is so unfair.
Most people would blame her for it.
What?
Belle wrinkled her nose. Men are never at fault in such things, she said sourly. Women shoulder the responsibility. And the shame. Adam felt that unpleasant feeling in his stomach at her words.
That's not right.
Belle was quiet, and his words died in the warm night air. Then, squeezing her eyes shut for a long moment, she sighed. Sorry, she whispered. Talking about him makes me angry too, I guess. She swallowed, but went on. This is so silly, but I wish it hadn't have been him.
What hadn't been him? Adam asked.
My first kiss, she admitted, burying her face against his sleeve. I wish it had been you, but he took that away from me. Adam's heart sank in his chest. Even in death, Gaston was still hurting her. Hurting Belle, hurting her friend. How many others were suffering from his legacy? Well, Belle wouldn't suffer from it. At least as little as possible, if he had any say in the matter.
Belle, what he did, that doesn't count, Adam said earnestly. He forced you to do something that you didn't want to do. So it doesn't count.
She looked at him, eyes hopeful. Really?
Of course.
He rolled onto his side and brushed the hair from her eyes. Then softly he kissed her himself.
But that counts, right?
He asked, pulling away. Belle nodded. Mm-hmm, she smiled.
And this one?
He asked, repeating the action. Belle giggled against his mouth, hands reaching up and holding the sides of his face with tenderness. He pulled back, looking down at her in the shadows of early night, her eyes full of the new stars above. He didn't know what it was. Perhaps it was something about seeing her here, in the place she came from, the place that made Belle, Belle. Or maybe it was simply the fact that they were lying here together, on the soft bed of her childhood. Either way, something in him was stirring, a heat he'd barely managed to keep at bay these last weeks together. And suddenly they were desperate again. And I'm skipping past this, okay? When the lantern's oil ran low and left them in near dark, however, Adam pulled back.
Bull, he said hotly.
She hummed.
I should probably sleep in my own tent tonight.
Belle opened her eyes, dark and throbbing. Probably. And so they left the little house on the hill, and later, as Adam lay alone in the quiet of the night, he felt certain for the first time that nothing could destroy his new happiness. Mon ami, do not get your gears in a twist.
Cogsworth spotted. Gears? I no longer have...
All is well, Lumiere went on in earnest, cutting him off. Nothing can destroy our plans now. Cogsworth sighed, staring back at him from a reflection in the palm of Lumiere's hand. A round mirror, small enough to fit snugly in a hidden pocket in his jacket, the only reflective surface within the castle capable of communicating with the world outside. The rest had been spellbound by old Agatha to show a false world beyond the walls, ensuring Cersei couldn't look and see the efforts of the others to free their prince and recruit the kingdom to their cause.
We expect another report at 10 o'clock sharp,
Cogsworth said then, checking his pocket watch and frowning. Yes, Lumiere whispered, looking around once again to ensure he was not overheard. He looked back at the mirror and grinned. Do not worry, I shall report then. Cogsworth nodded solemnly, and Lumiere snapped the small mirror shut in its dull bronze case. Tucking it in his pocket, he stood quietly for the moment, listening for a sound of bootfalls in the hall. Hearing nothing, he stepped quietly out of the unused office he had found refuge in, shutting the door behind him and heading to make his rounds through the castle. At one time, under the reign of the true king, and even in the service of their young master while under the curse, this task had been a fulfilling one. Mingling with those who worked here, ensuring the palace remained sparkling and bright. It had been a role he cherished. Now, however, it was nothing less than terrifying. Halls were lined with soldiers, lying in a brain-dead stupor. The sconces in these places had long since grown dim from neglect, for the servants King Victor brought with him avoided these places when they could. The enchantress seemed to leave them alone anyway, focusing her efforts on the soldiers. Her path through the palace was more than obvious, for she left these trails of lifeless men in her wake, not to mention the bright, deadly roses that grew along the floors and walls in her path. In fact, the palace now seemed but a strange, dark mirage of what it had once been. The stone guardian angels along its outer walls seemed to scowl, hunched over like demons. The walls throughout were lined with cracks, everything lifeless and grey, covered in shadows. Was it just an illusion, or were his own fears simply playing with him? Lumiere's thoughts were interrupted by wheels rolling near the gates. Frowning, he hurried to the front doors, just catching sight of a caged wagon rolling away through the mud before the guards shut the doors on him. "Who was that?" Lumiere asked them.
"A shipment for the king,"
one of them said. His voice was low and rough, a hint of strange amusement in it. "Shipment?" The soldier only smirked at him. His companion snickered. Lumiere frowned, turning on his heel and heading in search of the king himself.
"Think they'll let us have the leftovers?"
he heard one of the other men from behind. Two men laughed darkly. Lumiere wasn't sure what that meant, but he didn't like the way that they said it. Back through the halls he went, climbing winding stairs, heart beating as he neared the west wing. He was supposed to oversee all shipments, everything pertaining to the household. How had this escaped his notice? Lumiere sighed. Cogsworth would be disappointed. Perhaps there was a method to the man's madness after all. To all his hundreds of notebooks and lists for keeping such a large place in order. Still, it seemed strange that Victor would be up to anything. He certainly didn't know Lumiere's true intentions. In fact, he'd done little more than mope since Circe's arrival. Of course, her presence sent him into that strange bewitched trance when he obeyed her every bid, but given Circe was far too busy harvesting her powers from his men, the king was often left to his own devices, and once her spells wore off, he grew irritable and confused. Lumiere suspected that Victor knew something was off, just not exactly what. He passed more remains of the enchantress's work in his path. A few unlucky fellows among these actually looked dead.
Is she growing so desperate?
Lumiere wondered. He glanced back at the corpses and grimaced. They'd have to do something about those soon. The thought made him shudder. He reached the end of the west wing, standing before the grand doors to Prince Adams's old room. He wrinkled his nose, thinking of the great injustice of letting Victor dwell here, knowing how much darker the place looked now than it ever had before. He sucked in a breath, trying to brighten his mood. Just a little longer, he told himself. You just have to make it a little longer. Then, pulling himself into his most elegant, exaggerated posture, he knocked brightly on the door and stepped inside. Your Majesty, I have just come to inquire after... He stopped, staring across the dark bedchamber. And suddenly, terribly, he realized what that shipment had been. Victor sat at the end of his bed, several of his highest-ranking officers scattered across the room, held by each a woman.
No, a girl, for they were far too young to be the former,
each dressed in fine gowns, each wearing a chain about her ankle. Lumiere tried to form a question, a word even, but the sound died on his lips.
Oh,
he finally managed.
Slaves,
Victor answered lazily, licking his lips, eyes not leaving the girl beside him. Two more sat at his feet, trembling in fear. He brushed those large, swollen fingers over the child's cheek, watching in cruel amusement as she flinched away.
Beautiful ones. Virgins, even.
Seems even a peasant can be made into something enjoyable. Lumiere was now quite certain he was going to lose his mind. When had this kind of trade entered their kingdom? This is not how things are done here, he hissed through gritted teeth. Victor turned.
I am the king,
he said, looking at Lumiere straight on. His eyes were full of hunger, full of cruelty.
Everything I do is ordained by God, is it not?
Lumiere's hands were shaking with rage. Rage and fear. They had not anticipated this.
Your dinner performances are growing tiresome, Victor drawled,
turning back to the girl.
So I took matters of entertainment into my own hands. Now leave us, servant.
Lumiere stared at him. Their plan rested on his ability to keep Victor and the Enchantress unaware of Adam's rescue and King Alexander's preparations for attack. Should he abandon these innocents for the greater good? Could he? He grit his teeth against a curse, swallowing roughly. Lumiere bowed slowly and left the room. He stepped into the hall, pulling the small, unadorned mirror from his pocket. He flicked it open and stared at it for a moment. Stared at his only means for communicating with the outside. Then he smashed it against the wall. The candles nearby flickered nervously. Lumiere dropped the shattered case back into his pocket and turned to them.
The plan has changed, mes amis, he said darkly. We move now.
A half-dozen voices spoke at once.
Release me!
The golden sticks morphed into the forms of men. His footmen, armed and ready, given freedom to move between their old forms by Agatha herself. Lumiere nodded at them and re-entered the bedchamber. And yet he stopped dead in his tracks. For every man inside was now on the floor, eyes lifeless, chests empty, and oozing blood. Dead. Every man, that is, but the king himself. He was in the clutches of a tall, emaciated woman, latched in a terrible kiss that seemed to drain the very life from his eyes with each passing second. Cersei released him then, letting Victor gasp for breath and fall to his knees. She licked her lips, slowly, staring down at him in fury. Greying hairs draped over her face. "If there wasn't a chance I'd need you later," she said softly, voice like ice in the air, "then I'd kill you now." She looked up then, eyes locking with Lumiere's. He watched, frozen in fear, his men just as motionless behind him. She took a step closer, cocking her head. "Monsieur Lumiere," she said. She flashed a wicked grin, teeth red with blood. "You looked better as a candlestick, I think." A bead of sweat ran down his neck. She knew.
Oh God, she knew.
"I can sense those who have been touched by my magic," she went on. "You think I didn't notice you and your band of merry men earlier?" She laughed, a hoarse, terrible sound. "I have your prince. I have your king. I have 300 other men in my prison, hundreds more here in this palace, all in my power. You really think you have what it takes to defeat me?"
She doesn't know at all,
Lumiere realized in relief, thinking quickly. "Ah, enchantress, you have it all wrong," he said with false flair, even as a current of sweat seemed to flow from every pore of his skin. "Your arrival was quite a surprise. I could never presume to defeat such a powerful being as yourself. Indeed, we were only here to remove him from power." He indicated, pointing to Victor's now lifeless form. Eyes glazed over where he lay on the floor. Cersei stared at Lumiere for a long moment, considering. "Well, on that we can agree," she said at last, looking back at the king. Across the room the girls now cowered in fear, though the enchantress had left them untouched. Lumiere swallowed his own fear, and motioned to his men. "Get them out of here," he told the oldest. The man nodded, before inching past the enchantress on the far side of the room with the other footmen. Victor's slaves cried quietly at the approach, but soon relaxed when the footmen spoke to them and worked apart their bonds, following them from the room. Cersei didn't pay them any heed, however, just looking back down at Victor's writhing form. Her voice grew low. "I hate men like him," she rasped. "They think because they have power, they can do whatever they wish." Lumiere blinked in surprise. She looked back at him, as though sensing his thoughts. "Speak your mind, monsieur." She was perceptive. He would have to be somewhat honest if he were to keep her in the dark. "Forgive me, enchantress, but are you much different?" he said seriously, though hiding the true anger behind his words. "Preying on the weak? Our prince? When he was but a helpless child." "Helpless?" Cersei asked, wrinkling her nose and growing angry. "Helpless? A prince, with his every need and desire met? A prince having never suffered a day in his life? He had no choice in that. A prince whose father was too absorbed in his own importance to see those beneath him!" she shouted, with a strange and uncontrolled fury. Lumiere watched her unravel, frowning at the irony. "You can't judge people by who their father is, now can you?" he stated seriously. Cersei froze, snapping her head around and staring at him straight in the eyes. Lumiere's mouth grew dry, realizing his own mistake too late. Realizing his knowledge of her father, of the poor gardener who had abandoned her, was certainly something he couldn't have known, for it had been a tale told by Agatha, known only by Agatha. Lumiere cleared his throat nervously. "I mean, my own father. Awful a man, quite terrible," he fibbed, trying to undo the damage he had done. "I mean, I'm a really spectacular fellow. Really. We really shouldn't judge." The enchantress was before him in an instant. The words died in his throat as she towered over him, twice as tall as before. Her thin, wiry silver hair draped over her hollow cheeks and onto his shoulders. Her hands fell onto his shoulder, sending a shiver down his spine as she let it slide into his vest. She stopped at his pocket, reaching inside and pulling out the small, broken mirror. She looked at it, narrowing her bright, bleeding eyes in the dark room. "You put on a good show, sir, I admit," she rasped, "but not good enough." "Damn!" She dropped the mirror, gripping his throat in an instant with cold, scaly fingers. "You should have run when you had the chance," she whispered, breath like ice against his skin. "Now tell me, what do you know?" "I know nothing." She bared her teeth, moving closer. "You will tell me what you know, monsieur, or I will make you suffer until you do." "There is nothing to tell, enchantress." Circe snarled and squeezed, and Lumiere felt nothing. She pulled her hand back, as though burned by a hot stove. "What?" she breathed in shock, stepping back and staring at him with wide eyes. She had shrunk in stature again, and the small exertion enough to reduce her to her normal height. Lumiere's heart thundered in relief. "We really are protected from her, then?" he thought, breathing deeply. "Ah," he said, smirking and gaining confidence again. "You're not the first woman to gasp at my touch." Hissing, she flung her hands forth, golden chains flying at him, wrapping him head to toe. The moment she let them tighten, however, they dissolved into black mist. "You are too gentle," he went on, taunting. "You may be rough with me, ma gazelle." "Shut up!" she cried, forming several shining spears from nothing and sending them towards him. The weapons sagged mid-air, however, falling into the floor in a heap of dust. Lumiere laughed, Circe's frame quaking in response, her body shrinking further, back hunching and fingers growing thin and crooked. "Oh my," Lumiere observed, "you are not looking yourself." He stopped, growing serious and staring straight into those bloody eyes. "In fact, you are by far the greatest monster I've ever laid eyes on." Those red eyes grew wide, and backing away, she screamed. He was back. Back in these woods, under the cover of night. Back within the walls of his old prison. Adam breathed out through his mouth, slowly, trying to calm the throbbing in his heart.
"It's not your prison anymore," he told himself.
A hand in his, another on his arm, squeezing. "Are you all right?" Belle whispered. He nodded, then, realizing she couldn't see well in the darkness, spoke.
"Yeah."
She squeezed again, and they moved a few more paces, following Giles as he led them and a small handful of others among the thick summer growth, nothing but a dim lantern to guide them. Early sunlight soon broke over the mountain tops, casting faint shadows from the trees. With the new light, Adam caught sight of carvings in the bark, of claw marks made by the beast who had once roamed these woods. He breathed out again, breath shaking. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a fool. "You're pathetic." He frowned at the voice.
"No, I'm not,"
he told it. "You're..."
"No, I'm not,"
he told it firmly.
"I'm human."
The voice had stopped. They reached a familiar place, an opening in the trees, with a pile of debris placed naturally along the forest floor, the entrance to the bunker. Adam looked over at Belle, confused, but she simply stared ahead and waited for Giles to direct them towards them. No guard should be so far from the castle, she told them under her breath, but just in case the light breaking over the mountains will blind them for just long enough for us to get inside. Though still puzzled at why they were even here, Adam simply nodded. They waited for several minutes. Adam thought he felt early morning dew form on his arms, setting his hair on end, but didn't move. Then, just as the light broke over the mountain tops, Giles tugged at something in the brush. A quiet creak, and the trapdoor in the ground wound slowly open, much like the ceiling in Belle's room had opened the night before. Belle reached for Adam's hand, hurrying forward before releasing him and crawling inside. Adam looked in. A small wooden ladder was there now, and Belle was already several rungs down. She looked up at him and smiled. "Come, my love. It's quite safe." He nodded, curious now, and followed Belle down, landing in a sturdy wooden platform. The tunnel into the ground was enormous. The tiny dugout space he could just barely squeeze inside was now replaced by a space reinforced by heavy beams and large enough to fit a dozen men. "Are you surprised?" Belle asked, biting her lip excitedly, as they waited for the others to join them from above. Adam laughed quietly, looking around in awe.
"Yeah," he said. "You just wanted to see the look on my face, then? That's why all the mystery this morning?"
She grinned. "Yes." She sucked in an excited breath. "Papa designed it, though I did help a little," she said proudly. Her smile faltered. We found the references to the elevator prototypes in the library anyway."
"Elevator?"
Before she could explain, the floor beneath them began to move. He wobbled and grabbed the side of the platform to regain his balance. He looked up, eyes growing wide as the dirt walls around them seemed to move. He blinked, feeling the floor beneath him shift again.
No, the walls weren't moving. They were. "Agatha's magic!"
Adam gasped, watching the walls around them fly upward. Belle chuckled. "No, just a little engineering." The others seemed unfazed by this device, standing and chatting to themselves as the elevator sped up. It took only a minute to reach the bottom, the contraption slowing and landing with a thud on the ground. Belle led Adam off, and he looked back at the device. Several large pulleys were secured into the earthen walls, thick ropes winding through them and the platform up to the dark tunnel above. He heard a snort, turning to see a large horse hooked around the device, like an enormous wheel of a ship turning on its side. The animal looked rather pleased with itself, munching on an apple he had been rewarded for his work.
"There's a horse in the bunker?" Adam asked, bewildered.
"Mm-hmm," Belle said, smiling. "A few, actually. That's how we get down here." Adam looked up into the darkness.
"How do we get back up?"
"The same way," Belle explained. "The design of the pulley means it takes much less effort to lift the same weight. The animals can manage it easily." Adam blinked, looking around. What had once been little more than a tiny crawl space was now the size of a grand ballroom, though the ceiling was much shorter. The room was filled with people, soldiers mostly, wearing the uniform of his father's reign, some chatting in small groups while others ate at long tables. Torches lined the walls, secured into the dense earth. Adam walked up to one of these walls, pressing a hand into its surface, expecting the earth to crumble away. Yet it didn't budge. He gasped, heart in his throat, feeling that invisible brick-like surface there once again. "Don't worry," Belle said quickly. "It's like that for all of us. Agatha placed a barrier along these walls to protect us from any cave-ins." She reached for his hand, speaking softly. "You're not trapped anymore." Adam nodded, feeling foolish again for how quickly he had fallen into a panic. Calming himself, he looked back at the well-constructed space.
"Wow," he breathed. "You really have been busy."
Well, this has been built for a while, she said. We weren't sure how successful the recruitment would be, and wanted a means to sneak into the palace for a surprise attack, should we need to.
Sneak in?
She nodded, pointing across the room. Another tunnel was there, dark against the wall. A few guards standing on duty nearby. It connects to the passage you showed me, the one leading from the west wing.
My prince,
someone said. They turned, where Giles stood. He nodded, looking at them seriously.
It's time we prepare.
They retreated into a small dugout room nearby, separated from the others by a drape across the opening. Adam, Belle, their parents, Agatha, Henry, and a dozen other high-ranking soldiers stood around a table with piles of maps. These depicted the rooms and floors of the palace in detail, spread over several sheets. Other maps showed the palace grounds, a winding route of the tunnels beneath the earth and paths through the woods. Several figures were placed along the parchment, indicating where Victor's men were typically stationed, as provided to them by Lumiere's correspondence with Cogsworth. Adam recognized Belle's handwriting in many places. Assumed she had helped create the maps herself.
We've staged a threefold attack,
Giles was saying, indicating the positions with the tip of his finger.
Henry will lead the recruits down the main path, staging a mob attack. Then, with Victor's remaining forces distracted, our generals will take the soldiers into the palace through the tunnels.
He turned, facing Agatha.
I will follow with you, Sifu, plus an elite force. With the paths cleared, we should be able to corner Cersei and let you put an end to her.
Adam hummed.
What about us?
He asked, puzzled. Giles stopped, and the room seemed to grow especially quiet.
Once we have your father's approval of the plans, you will escape to safety,
he said, staring at the map. He looked up, scanning their faces. Eyes meeting Adam's, then Belle's, then the king and queen's.
All of you. What's this? Alexander asked, frowning deeply. You've done enough, your majesty,
Giles said, standing tall and sucking in a breath.
Take leave of this place. Let us fight, while you take refuge. Should victory be ours, we will send word to you. Giles, this was not the plan, Alexander said firmly. It would do no good if you were lost, Giles said in earnest. This way, if we fail, at least you have a chance to try again.
But, Giles, if you meant for us to leave, why did you train us to fight? Belle asked in confusion.
So you can be safe in your escape, he explained. Whatever happens, and wherever you go. Giles, this is nonsense, Alexander huffed. Our plan is foolproof. There's no need to take such precautions.
Cersei can't harm us, Jacqueline said more calmly. And Victor's men, from Lumiere's reports, they're nearly defeated as it is.
No plan is foolproof, Giles said, not budging. And even in the best of attacks, there are always casualties. Giles, I will not send my people in to fight my battles for me, Alexander said roughly. It's out of the question.
Giles grit his teeth, a strange look crossing his face. He turned to Adam and Belle, eyes full of anxiety. Adam had never seen him look so desperate before.
You two must go, at the very least,
Giles said. Begged, almost, his hands gripping the table's edge.
Please, my prince. You have suffered enough. You have one another now. You mustn't risk being separated again.
Adam stopped. He looked down at Belle.
What if he's right?
He asked her quietly.
What if this is a mistake?
She frowned. You would abandon them? No, he wouldn't. Belle knew him very well. Knew that he would never forgive himself for abandoning his people again, even if the first time wasn't his fault. Adam pursed his lips, turning back to Giles.
We're staying, he said firmly.
Giles' face contorted.
You don't know what you're risking,
he cried, slamming a fist on the table. Adam's eyes grew wide. He had never, ever seen the man so upset. He'd barely seen him grow irritable at times. Certainly nothing like this.
Giles? He started nervously. I'm sorry, but... My prince, you're being a fool! He shouted. Giles, said Alexander roughly. Enough of this. What's gotten into you?
Giles quieted, staring at the floor, gripping the table hard. Then, cursing under his breath, he turned and swept out of the room. The others remained quiet, awkward. Adam didn't know what to do, feeling he was at fault for this somehow. Beside him, Belle chewed her lip nervously. She looked back and forth between her feet and the door where Giles had disappeared. Eventually, Alexander sighed.
I've put too much on him, he said, looking regretful. Let him stew. He'll come around.
They soon dispersed, moving into the main hall for a late breakfast. Belle stopped, letting the others trail ahead, looking worried. I'm going to look for him, she said, starting to move away. Adam reached for her hand.
Me too.
There were other passages in this place. Rooms dug out to make space for supplies and a few sleeping areas. They found Giles in one of the latter, sitting on the edge of a dusty cot with his head in his hands. He gripped something in one palm, attached to a chain that trailed beneath his shirt. Belle ran to his side, hesitating before sitting beside him and touching his arm with a gentle hand. Giles looked up, surprised. He hadn't noticed the mentor.
Mademoiselle,
he said, voice rough. He turned to Adam.
My prince, forgive me. I acted out of turn.
Adam shook his head roughly, sitting on the cot across from them.
You're only worried. I'm sorry I've made you so upset.
Giles sighed.
That is not your fault, Prince Adam. In truth,
He sucked in a breath, squeezing whatever it was he held in his hand.
Well, there is a reason I am so fearful for the both of you,
he admitted. What reason? Belle asked carefully. Giles continued to look at Adam, eyes quaking. He had never seen the old commander look so vulnerable.
Your Highness, He swallowed. I fear that, to hear it, you will think ill of me.
Adam frowned.
Giles, you're one of the best men I know,
he said in earnest. It was true, in fact. Giles had sort of become a second father to him, especially in all those years without a true one.
I never could think ill of you.
Giles smiled a little sadly and nodded.
So be it.
This is a flashback, and guys, this bit is very important for Giles's story arc, but it contains some truly horrible things. So if you want to skip to the next chapter, please go ahead, but I won't be offended if you don't. Giles finished folding up the last shirt, placing it with care atop the others. His hands were shaking. He looked around his room once more, heart racing at the thought of seeing it again. A small painting sat on the dresser. He looked around his room once more, heart racing at the thought of never seeing it again. A small painting sat on the dresser. A lovely woman with his same dark black hair and green eyes, staring at him with warmth. His mother, gone but a year now.
I wish I could talk to you,
Giles thought, picking up the frame and swallowing hard against the lump in his throat.
I wish I knew what you thought of me now.
Would she be ashamed of him, like father? Or would she understand? Running a finger over the frame, he sucked in a breath and tucked it between the folded clothes before shutting the travelling case and securing the clasps. Blowing out one final candle, he grabbed the case and headed into the dark halls. Moving on silent feet, he paused before a door down the hall. His sister's room. Cecile would be fast asleep by now, and as much as he wished to tell her goodbye, he knew he couldn't risk it. For as much as he loved her, he knew her loyalties lay with their father. So, instead, he pulled a letter from his pocket and slipped it silently beneath the door. By the time she awoke and retrieved it, he would be long gone. 10 minutes later, he was at the front gates, reins in one hand as he guided a horse slowly along the path. He turned back, staring at the dark outline of his home for a final time. Then, with a burst of courage, he mounted and took off into the black night.
You made it!
John breathed in relief. Giles slid off his horse, gasping for breath. There'd really been no need to ride so quickly, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to go terribly wrong, or the need to look over his shoulder every few minutes. Now he was looking back once again. The small dirt road was empty and silent. The only sound, the trickling of a nearby stream. He shook his head, sighing in relief. Jean's hand found his in the darkness. You okay?
Yes.
They embraced. Jean's heart seemed to be beating just as fast as his broad frame quaking against him. So he was just as anxious then.
All right,
Giles said, pulling back and sucking in a breath.
Let's go.
They rode south, stopping when the sun crested the hills and the roads began to fill with early travellers. Jean's arms had grown loose around Giles's waist in the last hour, cheek pressed against his back as he snored.
Jean, wake up!
Giles chuckled, looking over his shoulder.
Let's find some place to get some real sleep.
They stopped at the nearest inn, leaving the horse at the adjacent stable and securing a room for the day. For while it was unlikely Giles's father could hunt him down this point, they both felt safer travelling by night. Later that evening they sat waiting for supper in the inn's tavern, speaking quietly at a table in the shadowed corner of a room.
Paris! Can you believe it?
Jean whispered. Giles smiled, the nerves from their escape finally settling into excitement. They planned to sell the horse upon arrival in Paris, and use the money to rent a room until they could find work. Ideally as city guards. Both were more than qualified for it. And Paris was large. They could hide there indefinitely and never fear discovery. It would be a humble life, far more so than Giles would ever experience. But for the first time, the future seemed full of hope instead of dread, love instead of shame. His heart raced at the thought. He did love Jean. That much was certain. But for all their plans, those words had yet to be spoken. Jean leaned him close.
What do you want to see first? He asked eagerly. Notre Dame? The Champs-Élysées?
Giles barely heard him, however, for another conversation had caught his attention.
From what I hear, they'll be overrun by Whigs and...
Giles frowned, turning towards the voice. 3 soldiers sat at a nearby table, speaking in hushed tones over their cheese and wine.
Do tourists do?
Jean went on, then frowned.
Giles? That damn Prussian prince,
another soldier observed.
Can't go 6 months without creating some new border conflict.
Poor blokes, the third replied, taking a swig from his glass. Glad we were assigned down south before all hell broke loose. Giles's heart seemed to stop. He looked back at Jean, who was now staring at him with wide eyes.
Our home, Jean whispered. It's in danger.
Giles finished. Given his father was the governor of a bordering region of the province, it was his primary duty to defend his people against invaders. Yet, knowing his father, he wouldn't take any risks that would put his own life in harm's way. Their people needed a true leader, and it was what Giles had prepared himself for his entire life. And now, he had abandoned them. He clenched his fists, squeezing his eyes shut. That overwhelming drive for duty was back, tearing at his heart, shaming him for daring to think he deserved to do something for himself.
We better hurry back,
Jean said softly. Giles looked up. Jean was watching him, eyes sadder than he'd ever seen them.
Jean,
you'll never be able to forgive yourself if you don't, will you? He pressed. Sucking in a breath, he found Giles's hand beneath the table.
It's all right,
he went on bravely. He smiled, feared a bit forced.
Really, we'll find another way.
Giles's heart sank even further in his chest. Yet, after a long, aching moment, he nodded. The ride back felt twice as long as before. They took a private road along the ocean side, high along the rocky cliffs. Distant waves crashed far below. floating over the empty night air. It wasn't far now. Giles slowed the horse near the place where the trees grew thick, coming to a stop. "What is it?" Jean asked. Giles looked towards the distant moon, bright against the clouds above.
"If we're really at war," he whispered, "everything is going to change."
"Everything was going to change today anyway," Jean said, a forced lightness in his voice.
"Not like this."
They dismounted in silence, leaving the horse in the trees and moving slowly towards the cliffside. They sat on the rocky ledge, legs hanging into the empty night air, a salty breeze pushing into the empty night. A salty breeze brushing the hair from their eyes. It might be the last minutes of peace they would ever have together for a long time, and they both knew it. Nothing was certain now. The thought tugged at Giles's chest. He dropped his face into his hands.
What if this was a mistake?
A warm arm wrapped around him, squeezing his shoulders. "Hey, it's all right," Jean said in encouragement. "It was a stupid idea to leave anyway. I shouldn't have suggested it." He paused, sighing. "I guess I wanted to make you happy."
"You do make me happy."
Jean held him tighter, pressing his face into Giles's shoulder. Giles looked over and managed to smile. A sad one, but a smile all the same. If nothing else, he had this moment. And suddenly, he realized he needed to take it.
"Jean,"
he said quietly. He reached over, touching Jean's cheek. Jean looked up with those light blue eyes from the darkness, waiting. But for all Giles's determination to say so, the words didn't come. Jean smiled then and pulled away. He reached for the sword at his waist, sliding it out halfway and tugging the ribbon from his hair with his free hand. Giles furrowed his brows, watching as Jean leaned down and wove a section of his hair beneath the blade. A small lock was sliced free, and Jean tugged the sword away. He reached for Giles's hand, placing the lock of hair in his palm. "So you'll always have a part of me with you," he explained quietly. "No matter how long we have to wait." Giles curled his fingers over the lock of hair, holding it tight. He leaned down and kissed the man he loved. It would be the last time.
"You filthy pig!"
Giles's heart grew cold. He turned, staring in the direction of that terrible voice. A familiar voice. 5 lanterns emerging from the darkness, a large shadow emerging from their midst.
"Take them,"
the voice said. Any other time, even 5 on 2 would have been nothing for them to handle. But now, these men had the advantage of surprise. Giles quickly found his arms held tight on either side, the 2 guards forcing him to his knees. Nearby, it took 3 to hold Jean at bay. He was shouting at them. "Get off me!" he cried. "Let us go!" Heavy breathing sounded from the shadows. Their leader stepped into the light.
"Father!"
Giles gasped, cold dread falling into his stomach, though he had already known who it was. Even Jean had grown silent at the sight of him.
"Father," he said, I can explain."
His words were cut off, a sharp force ramming into his jaw and whipping his head to the side.
"So am I!" his father shouted in rage.
The pain flowed over his skin, sinking deep into his skull. Giles didn't have a moment to catch his breath before the second blow.
"Bastard!"
Giles sucked in a breath, body quaking from shock.
"Father, please!"
A knee to the stomach, and he gasped for breath. The beating didn't last long, shorter than those of his youth, but filled with greater rage than any before. His father was holding nothing back. One final fist to their head and the guards released him. Giles fell from his knees to the earth, tasting the blood that ran from his temple, coughing up more. "Giles!" He could barely hear Jean, for all seemed to grow quiet and bright. His head pulsed, and he stared at the dead grass beneath his fingertips that blurred in and out of his vision. "Giles!"
"Leave us,"
his father said darkly, and from somewhere nearby,
and dispose of that scum.
Giles's heart flew into his throat.
No,
he rasped, yet he barely made a sound.
My lord,
said one of the guards, clearly reluctant to fulfill such a task.
You heard me.
Jean was pulled away by the soldiers, still screaming his name.
No! Jean!
Giles choked out, reaching desperately with quaking fingers.
You can't!
Another kick to the stomach. He found himself rolling towards the cliffside, the waves thrashing against the rocks far below. Giles realised with bitterness that it was only after he had been beaten to the point he couldn't stand did his father dare face risking him again.
After Cecile showed me that letter, I just knew you'd come crawling back here, he snarled. But I never imagined.
His father's words trailed off, and a gun cocked. A gun far too close for it to be Jean. His father held a dark pistol now, aiming directly for his heart. Giles's eyes grew wide.
Father, you are no son of mine,
his father said. His voice grew low.
You are no man. You're nothing but a filthy creature that has no place in this world.
Giles closed his eyes.
Maybe there's a place for us there, he thought. A place on the other side.
He waited with dread. Yet, instead of a gunshot, he only heard a wet gasp. Opening his eyes, Giles looked up in shock. The tip of a thin sword emerged from his father's gut, dripping blood from its tip.
You're wrong, my lord, a voice said quietly. There's no place for you in this world.
The sword slid back, more blood gushing from the wound. His father choked once, dropping the pistol. Then his eyes rolled into the back of his skull and he fell to a heap in the ground. Behind him stood Jean. He held not one but two swords, the second already coated in blood along with the rest of his clothes. Giles hoped that blood wasn't his own. Funny he should worry about such when his own father lay dead in the grass. Yet, at the sight of that, he felt nothing. Strong arms reached beneath him. Jean knelt at his side, breathless, cradling Giles in his arms as he shook. The blade sat abandoned at his side.
Giles! He gasped. Are you all right? I've been better.
Jean only grimaced, wiping away the stream of blood from Giles's head with a trembling hand, and looking close to tears. He looked behind him, then towards the dead body in the grass.
Oh, God! Will you ever forgive me? I killed him! He was going to kill me, Jean.
I know, he conceded. He stared back towards the dark trees, holding Giles tighter. I don't know if I killed the others or not. I just ploughed through them so I could reach you. I was barely thinking. He looked back at Giles, wiping more blood from his head with the cuff of his sleeve.
We've got to get you to a doctor so you can... There he is!
Someone shouted. They looked towards the trees. More guards emerged from the shadows. They must have heard the earlier commotion. The new men stared at the scene, Giles's dead father on the ground, and the blood soaking Jean's shirt.
He killed the governor! One of them cried, and attacked Lord Giles!
Several lifted their guns, surrounding them slowly. Jean stood quickly, moving back, hands held high in the air. The sound of cocking guns rang out regardless.
No! Giles rasped. Stop! He didn't!
Too late. 3 blasts in a row. The darkness sent the first 2 into the empty air, but the third caught flesh. Jean's shoulder flew back, feet stumbling at the impact, body dipping dangerously close to the ledge behind him.
Jean!
Jean's eyes shot towards Giles, wide and scared. With one final, inevitable step back, his foot landed in open air. He stretched an arm out, reaching towards Giles in desperation. Then his body fell away into the darkness. Jean! Giles tugged himself towards the cliff, ignoring the way his body screamed at him, nearly slipping over the ledge himself. Rough hands grabbed him, holding him back.
Jean!
He screamed again, fighting them with only his strength he had left, staring into the sea. Yet he saw nothing. Nothing but the bright reflection of the moon against the waters. No sound but the crashing of the waves against the rocky cliffs below. His body grew numb, mind in shock, fingers gripping the lock of hair still tight in one palm. It didn't seem real. It couldn't be real. And yet it was. And it was all his fault.
It was in my focus on duty that I sacrificed love,
Giles explained. But you couldn't have known, Belle said thickly. She was gripping his hand hard, eyes full of tears. He patted her hand with the other, sighing.
It didn't matter. The price was paid whether I wanted it to or not.
The prince sat in silence, staring at the ground with unblinking eyes. Giles could tell that Adam hadn't quite understood at first. Perhaps never heard of such a person as himself. Such things were not spoken of, after all, and the prince had been given little opportunity to experience the world beyond these woods. However, after a moment, the prince's face contorted, and to the boy's credit, he reached over and rested a hand on his shoulder.
Giles, I'm so sorry,
he said sincerely.
It is all right, my prince. I only share this so you understand.
He squeezed the locket once again, the surface cool against his palm.
I have lived a life alone for my choice. I cannot bear the same for either of you.
The young couple was silent, thinking quickly.
Let's just ask Agatha,
he said suddenly.
She can see the future, right? Only when you're sure of your path, child.
A voice spoke. They turned, spotting the old enchantress standing in the threshold, looking at them curiously. Adam opened his mouth to go on, but she stopped him with her hand.
Not that it matters. I've been trying to see the end of this battle for months now. Nothing,
she said, frowning deeply.
There's nothing there. Nothing at all. I should be able to see something. Unless the whole lot of you are planning to do something completely unpredictable, she huffed.
Adam grew nervous at that. He looked at Belle, who stared back at him as though reading his thoughts. What if it fails? Because we weren't there, she whispered. Could we ever be happy if they're not free? Adam knew the answer, even before she finished asking it.
No, he realised. We couldn't. I'm sorry, Giles,
Adam said,
but we have to see this through. To the end.
Giles closed his eyes.
I should have known. You are too good a lad to take the selfish way out. In which case?
He sucked in a breath and stood, gripping the blade at his belt.
I will go with you both, to the end. Sir Giles!
Someone called out. He turned, frowning towards the door, where Cogsworth now appeared. He looked winded, leaning against the wall and sucking in a deep breath.
Giles! It's Lumiere! What about him? Giles asked. He hasn't checked in.
Cogsworth explained.
He's overdue by a full 47 minutes.
He insisted, tapping furiously on the face of his pocket watch.
He could simply be detained, Giles said. I admit this is quite late, but from his recent reports, Victor has been proving more difficult to handle than usual.
I don't know, Cogsworth said, uncertain. He pulled a small mirror from his pocket, a twin to the one Lumiere carried.
I can't even get the blasted thing to react anymore.
Agatha said, swiping the object from the man and taking a look. She pressed her fingers against it, then frowned deeply.
Oh, well, that's because his side has been destroyed.
She stopped, words catching up to her. They all froze, looking to Giles in unison. He frowned deeply.
Well then,
he said, narrowing his eyes.
Tonight, we strike.
End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that one. Oh my god, that was a long one. And Giles' backstory. Oh my god, give the man a hug. Poor man, losing the love of his life to his own father after his love killed his father to save his life. Oh my god, poor man. And Poor Jean. And can I say, that opening scene with the two triplets deciding that Belle is their friend, confessing what made their mother sick, and that Belle is agreeing that, yes, we are friends. And their little sister being close with Chip and playing a sitting game so he's not left out. That's really cute. And am I the only one who noticed that Chip was blushing? Okay, little boy, you're only 10. Calm down. Anyway, you guys know the drill. Like, comment and subscribe and hit that bell to get notified for whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Bye my guys, gals and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Take care.